I like the puppets.
Yeah. Oh,
And I practice the puppets face dropping.
I have never seen you need to use those more often.
Yeah, there you go. All right, my friends. Today's topic is America and Israel and their interactions over the years. I'm going to try very hard to avoid the internal politics that generally cause every discussion to turn into a war scene within. I mean, I will tell you that when I go to Yom Limud and there are discussions on Israel, I refuse to go anymore because every session turns into a political war where people are screaming one another down. That's exactly what I don't want to have happen here. All right. Secondly, clearly, we're talking about 74 years of Israel and American relations. By very definition, I have chosen certain things because 74 years would take 74 years to teach about. All right, so there's a selection and everybody would choose differently in so doing. So bear with me. If you feel I've stepped out of line and I've gone through and tried to eliminate any real harsh political statements, all right, let me know. At the end, I am leaving more time than usual because I realize this is a hotter topic. This is something where there's some emotions, but I'm going to ask everybody to couch their terms with respect without a sense of I have the absolute wisdom. Because if you have the absolute wisdom, Israel is waiting to hear it. They haven't figured it out, neither have we. All right. So that said, the relationship of Zionism and Israel to American Jews has been notable for its ironies and its contradictions over the last several centuries. In the pre-state era, even though Zionism was largely irrelevant to American Jews in the pre-state era, their extraordinary efforts at fundraising and political support made the existence, the very birth of Israel, a possibility. Ultimately, in its large frame, there has been no other country whose citizens have been committed to the success of another country as American Jews have been to Israel. That's a powerful statement. Nevertheless, having said that, the vast majority of American Jews who have related to Israel, the vast majority of Jews have related to Israel through their American identity, and they've remained astonishingly ignorant of the very object of their devotion, the state of Israel. So let's go back a little bit. Beginning in the 19th century, European Zionists and American Jews were diametrically opposed to one another on numerous worldviews. Classical Zionism thought anti-Semitism was all-pervasive and impervious to any of the liberalism in which American Jews had placed their trust. They believed that diasporic life in the diaspora, was inevitably doomed. Zionists maintained that the only solution was for all Jews to emigrate to Palestine, form a state of their own, a place in which they could fully and safely live out authentic Jewish lives. This philosophy, this ideology, had little effect on American Jews. American Jews were optimistic, they were pragmatists, and had already half fulfilled hopes in America, and that contradicted the Zionist approach. At best, for American Jews in that period, Zionism appeared irrelevant, and at worst, it raised the specter of dual loyalty. It's only when American Zionism was able to demonstrate its compatibility with American patriotism that it began to gain broad appeal. The principal architect of that, and you keep hearing his name throughout this, is Louis Brandeis. He had set a personal example. He set the intellectual foundations, which reassured American Jews that adherence to Zionism did not compromise their primary identity as American Jews. For Brandeis, as a matter of fact, a Jew became a better American as he or she worked to further the principles of freedom in Palestine. And ignoring the Zionist ideology, Brandeis directed the American movement to concentrate on tasks of economic and agricultural development in the land of Palestine. The fear of the charge of dual loyalties, we still live with that to some degree, and it rises at certain moments, continued through the early years of World War II. Although American Jews agitated against the 1939 British white paper that effectively closed Palestine as a refuge for Nazi victims, it also pushed for increased immigration quotas to America. Their efforts, American Jews' efforts, they realized were limited by the fear of alienating all their fellow citizens. One frustrated Zionist leader said the following: "The American Jew thinks of himself first and foremost as an American citizen. This is a fact, whether or not we like it." So that's the state of things in the early years. Any insights? I just keep it somewhat brief again, because there's lots of material and I want to get lots of people in. Any particular insights to this early year period? Okay. That said, so you now have the horror of the Holocaust as it emerges, transforming American Jewish relationship to Zionism. A Jewish state could provide a haven for survivors. It could help assuage American Jewish guilt at the failure to save European Jewry, and it provides a powerful counterweight to the image of Jewish passivity. So the Holocaust, as it became a known factor, changed how American Jews began to think about Israel. American Jews now embraced the idea of a Jewish state en masse and acted with an unprecedented communal assertiveness. By 1945, with the conclusion of the war, over 2.5 million Jews, almost half of the Jewish population, belonged to organizations that endorsed the goal of a Jewish state. Between the end of the war and 1948, they contributed an astonishing $400 million for Israel's relief, development, and defense. Think of that in terms of 1940 dollars. For the time being, they abandoned their fears of dual loyalty, and American Jews launched a campaign of mass publicity to convince the American public to endorse the creation of the State of Israel. It was their persistent lobbying that induced President Truman to disregard the advice of the State Department and to support the creation of the State of Israel at the United Nations, and to use American influence to urge others to do the same. All right, so you see the power of the awareness of what a lack of state can be in what happened in the Holocaust in terms of American support in its early stages of Israel. The emergence of the state has an enormous and immense impact on American Jews. Mesmerized by the state's symbolic power, most American Jews were initially content to support Israel without questioning and to enthusiastically provide whatever financial and political aid the Israeli government deemed appropriate. It's this new wonderful thing, and it's ideological and it's symbolic. It's not real in a sense. However, almost immediately after independence, Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion, who may have been attempting to deflect American demands for power sharing, Americans who wanted to have a say in Israel, launched a bitter verbal assault informing American Zionists that they must emigrate to Israel because life in the diaspora was doomed, and that despite all of America's freedoms, America was a spiritual exile. And he went on to say that any Zionist who remained in America was not a Zionist, and any Jew who lived in exile was an inferior Jew. This was at a time when Aliyah was so low, it was a source of embarrassment to the Zionists. Here we've opened the doors, the opportunity, a 2,000-year prayer has been answered and no one's knocking on the door. Or certainly not the numbers they anticipated. In many ways, these comments by Ben-Gurion left the American Jewish community equipped to do little more than to write checks in support of Israel. Most American Jews were simply oblivious to these kinds of changes that were happening, precisely because they were relating to Israel in an emotional and symbolic way. They perceived the Jewish state to be a series of cliches. I heard this at home from my mom. It's a secular nation of go-getters who made the desert bloom. It's a religion of progressive action. It's a Middle Eastern outpost of American values. Those are cliches. They're not real. Not real life. Yes, there's a truth to them, but they're symbolic. And these somewhat contradictory but always benevolent images were vital to the American self-conception and to the presentation of Israel to the other Americans, to the larger society. And even more, a more powerful myth of the American Jews was that the Zionist notion that Israel was the culmination of Jewish history. As American Jews, American Jewry was assimilating its way towards what Charles Silberman would call the first free diaspora society. What you were starting to see was overt religious expression declining. Judaism became increasingly nostalgic and emotional. And to equate, I found this fascinating, to equate Israel with Judaism was a comforting way to avoid the responsibility of religion by focusing one's Jewishness on a secular state 8,000 miles from home. I can deflect my Judaism. A new class of Jewish professionals, such as educators, community relations specialists, fundraisers, these all arose in the suburbs, and they soon discovered that Israel was the most effective means to counter the growing religious indifference within their communities. Open to comments at this point.
Mm-hmm.
Wow, I've never seen this group so quiet. Eric.
No, I mean, I did seem to, I did seem to notice in my own experience with Israel Bonds that other organizations would fundraise, would put Israel front and center, even though a lot of the money they were raising would not be going to Israel.
Yep. And we'll talk a little bit about that in terms of more recent. Martin.
Well, just one comment, and that is that the United States was not Israel's biggest supporter in the early years, right? It was the United States that forced them out of Sinai during the Sinai campaign. And it was only after the Six-Day War that America started supplying military equipment to Israel. Up to that point, it was the French.
Yeah, absolutely. You've set me up because that's where I'm going in just a second. Perfect. Anybody else?
I was just going to say, I'm in that first generation of kids, pretty much after World War II. And I remember in Sunday school in my very traditional conservative synagogue in Connecticut, Israel was, it was pretty big that we should support Israel. And I don't recall, being a child, who knows, but I don't recall there being very much, if anything, said against Israel. If people believe that, they were pretty quiet.
So is this prior to 67 or after 67?
Oh, this is prior to 67. I was already in college in 67.
All right. We're going to talk a little bit about American willingness to speak as well. That's one of the directions I'm going. You're absolutely right. All right. So on May 15th of 67, Nasser mobilizes his army and declares on May 26th that his goal is to annihilate Israel. Abraham Joshua Heschel captures the sense of foreboding if you somebody who has if you have, I put the readings in the chat room. I apologize, I didn't get them out. I had not made that. So if you have them in the chat room, raise your hand, somebody to read number 1. All right, Eric, you got the first square, so go ahead.
Yeah. Terror and dread fell upon Jews everywhere. Will there be another Auschwitz, another Dachau, another Treblinka? In those days, many of us felt that our own lives were in the balance of life and death. That indeed, all of the Bible, all of Jewish history was at stake. The vision of redemption, the drama that began with Abraham.
So Heschel continues, and he actually calls this period an awesome time. It's a collapse of complacency. Let me see if I can fix that. Hold on 1 second. Let's see.
Where are the readings? It's not in this chat.
If you're not finding, half the people, hold it, stop. Half the people cannot see it, and half can. It is in the chat, but I'm not sure why. So if you have it, we'll read it.
Okay.
All right, I'm trying to silence everybody, and I'm not having the ability to do that right now. So, here we go. Okay, there we go. I'm going to continue on now. All right. So Heschel calls this a collapse of complacency. And while the prospect of defeat triggers despair among Jews worldwide, Israel's stunning victory empowers the American Jewish community and brings American Jewish concern for Israel to a peak. What you had before, as Martin was describing, was this sense of quietness, in the sense of it, we weren't the biggest supporters, and now American Jews are just exploding in this moment. There's a renewed sense of Jewish interdependence and resolve that, unlike the response to World War II, this time there would be an aggressive Jewish American commitment. Israel's stunning victory enables the creation of a salvation myth, a full theology of Holocaust and redemption. And it enables Jews to reconcile the Holocaust with the covenant of God, that God is going to protect the Jews, and to somehow have some way of integrating the Holocaust into Jewish religious consciousness. Now, I'm not going to suggest that that's a good answer. Anybody, you have to struggle with that on your own. But in that moment of surprise victory, it did serve a particular purpose. According to Jacob Neusner, it was a myth of darkness followed by the light of passage from the netherworld, and then purified by suffering and by blood into a new age. Somebody have the readings? If you have the readings, let's look at reading number 2 by Jacob Neusner. Somebody see it? Nobody else? All right, I'll read number 2. I'm not sure why that is, and I apologize. All right. So it says the extermination of European Jewry would become the Holocaust as a label only on June 9, 1967, when, in the aftermath of a remarkable victory, the state of Israel celebrated the return of the people of Israel to the ancient wall of the temple in Jerusalem. On that day, the extermination of European Jewry attained the, if not happy, at least via the ending that serves to transform events into a myth and to endow a symbol with a single ineluctible meaning. Israel's survival of 67, he's saying, gives meaning, at least some meaning. It's not full meaning to what happened in the Holocaust. It's a fulfillment of a myth of destruction leading to redemption. The Six-Day War also coincides with an identity crisis for American Jews. We're losing our place, as I described. Nevertheless, because the Black Power movement made overt ethnicity, it made it acceptable, American Jews are now beginning to feel a freedom to express their commitment to Israel in ethnic as well as religious terms. And over the next 15 years, feelings of pride and vulnerability characterize the American relationship to Israel. Scholars spoke of Israel as the very center of concern, whose total and unquestioning support had become the principal component of the new civil religion of American Jews. Stephen Cohen's surveys for the AJC, for the American Jewish Committee, found that 1/3 of American Jews, this is post-67, to be passionately pro-Israel, 1/3 to be reflexively so, 28% to be indifferent, and only 5% in any way antagonistic. Emotional issues, such as the 1973 UN vote equating Zionism with racism, mobilizes a large percentage of the Jewish community. Those are the moments we come together. Enforcing the unity of opinion among the rank and file was not very difficult, since secular veneration of the Jewish state was combined with a kind of intense proficient reality. Judaism was increasingly defined as, 1, singing Hava Nagila but not learning Hebrew; 2, visiting Israel with no thoughts of actually settling there; and 3, generously giving to the Jewish state without getting involved in the issues surrounding its development. That's what Judaism became in those years. For millions of American Jews, criticism of Israel was worse than intermarrying. They generally accepted the notion that diasporic criticism of the land of Israel was immoral, it was dangerous, and it further supported world anti-Semitism. It was telling that the only issue that did elicit American Jewish establishment of criticism of Israel was Prime Minister Golda Meir's instructions to American Jews to vote for Nixon in the '72 election. Jewish leaders regarded this as unwarranted interference in American experience. Again, I'll stop for a second. I want to give people a chance to talk. Okay. Who are you? Are you not Jewish? Yes, Martin.
Okay, no, I had a comment to make. I think the '67 war dramatically changed attitudes toward Israel. Previous to that, when Israel was established as the Jewish state, there were so many different views in this country, and there were many congregations, including Beth Israel and Emmanuel in this city, that broke off as in reaction to Zionism, where one congregation was anti-Zionist and the other was pro. And I think the '67 war really changed attitudes dramatically, because there were so many differences before that.
Right, particularly as you described, particularly in the Reform movement. Right. Anybody else? And I'll share some perspectives of the movements in a little while as well on this issue. So so after '67, there's this unity of thought. Eric, did you have a comment?
No, when you mentioned Golda Meir's comments, it's kind of ironic that Nixon probably had it in mind when he gave aid to Israel in the Yom Kippur War.
Oh, for sure.
Much as they didn't like it, it probably helped predispose Nixon to helping Israel at that crucial time.
Yeah, look, the reality of it is American politics is affected by all of this and statements that happen. And absolutely. And I promise you, Ben, that Netanyahu's comments and his relationship with American presidents also affects how things play out. It's just the reality. Absolutely.
Oh, Cantor?
Yes.
I have a question. How was, when during the establishment of Israel for the War of Independence, when Americans, went to Israel to fight, to be in the Air Force, etc., how was that viewed by other Americans?
I'm at a loss to answer that question. I don't have I have general ideas, but is there somebody who can answer that better than I can?
And did the State Department support that, or?
So I can't imagine the State Department was supporting it. They may have been indifferent, but I can't imagine they supported it.
Yeah, well, the bottom line is there weren't that many. It was very, very small.
Yeah.
Like, how many would you estimate?
I don't know, but it's not a big group of
It's
people.
not. If you know, I would ask you if you have the time and you have a chance with Ben Geffen. Ben is in his 90s and he was in Mexico. He went to Israel during that time. He built kibbutzim. He served in the army. He's a wonderful source of stories about that period of time, and I certainly encourage you to spend some time with him if you can. My lunches with him have been some of the most rewarding moments I've had. It's been wonderful. All right, so we have after 67 the sense of unity, and it's about to change. The Yom Kippur War transforms the relationship of Israel and ultimately to the Holocaust. Well, the Six-Day War helped create this triumphant salvation myth. The Yom Kippur shatters the illusion of Israeli military invincibility and signals that Jews are still vulnerable to mass murder. Shortly after that, the tenure of Prime Minister Menachem Begin marks a beginning of a new independence for American Jews in the relationships to Israel. On the one hand, the end of the Labor Party's monopoly and the emergence of the right-wing Likud meant that there's no longer one Israel from which to take direction. You now had multiple Israels in the political parties that exist. On the other hand, new developments, political developments, such as the peace treaty with Egypt, increases Israel's security and presents the government now with a range of controversial choices. You don't deal with a lot of internal politics when you're constantly being existentially threatened. In the case of when war is put aside, suddenly internal politics begin to emerge. And with that, division. As American Jews responded to these new conditions, consensus gives way to a gradually widening fragmentation. At first, public criticism of Israel is still inhibited by old fears. But then, public disagreement with the Jewish state by individuals really starts to appear. New political conflicts give rise to an overt split between American Jewish organizations and various Israeli governments. And finally, it also leads to attempts by some Jewish organizations here in America to actually override the policies of the Jewish state by lobbying Congress and appealing to the American Jewish public. This plays out loudly in 1982 with Israel's invasion of Lebanon, which leads to the first mass show of independence by American Jews. Although the campaign is being presented by Israel as a limited incursion, Defense Minister Ariel Sharon soon takes it and pushes towards Beirut with the objective of routing the PLO. American Jews, again, we're overgeneralizing, but American Jews feel increasingly anxious about Israel's disregard of its self-imposed geographical limits, as well as the number of casualties, of civilian casualties that are occurring. And once again, the American Jewish establishment publicly supports the invasion in the face of world criticism of Israel, and that in a moment of war, and that for the time being inhibits most outcry by American Jews. But this inhibition is breached. It's breached after the massacre of hundreds of Palestinian civilians in refugee camps by Christian forces that are allied to Israel. To supporters of the Israeli government, the American criticism stemmed from American Jewish embarrassment of Israel's failure to reflect American values. And it speaks of a dangerous naivete about Middle Eastern politics. Like any good argument, both arguments on this are right. And there is a naivete, and both sides are right, and that's where you find the problems. All right, Pollard. We talked about Pollard last week. 3 years later, it leads to the most serious breach yet. In November of '85, Pollard is arrested and charged with spying for Israel. American Jews take the lead in not only denouncing the operation as monumentally stupid for imperiling special relationships between the countries, but also American Jews take the lead in the demand for punishment of all those responsible. Israel, unaccustomed to being lectured by their American cousins, reacts bitterly. Shlomo Alvaneri, a political scientist and the former general of Israel's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, accuses American Jews of demonstrating a cringing exile mentality and by being motivated by fears of charges of dual loyalty. Right? That's what's coming out of Israel. Leading American Jews write in reply to him, emphasizing the courage of American Jews in defending settlement building in the invasion of Lebanon. Eric, if you have reading number 3, why don't you do that for us? This is Abraham Foxman. You need to unmute though.
Yeah. However much we were disconcerted by those policies, we never shrank from our Jewishness, nor did we waver in our support for Israel. And we aren't cringing when we disavow Israeli espionage against the U.S. in the strongest terms.
Right. You've got conflict between American Jewish leadership and Israeli Jewish leadership, Jewish leadership. All right. One accuses the other, and the response comes back. Again, I'm open to comments if anybody has any. Rosalind, I see you speaking, but you're on mute.
Has the U.S. gone after any other spies of our
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, for sure.
Of our allies?
Well, there haven't been many. I mean, the reality of it is, let's just say there haven't been many that have come to the forefront and made public.
Well, with those that have, though, to be fair, one of the Pollard's defendants will say he's received a disproportionate punishment. For, when you compare other people who are, spying for money, for whatever, for actually, basically passing secrets of the Soviet Union. Mm-hmm. Nobody got the sentence that Pollard got.
Yeah, that's
a comment about that. Number one, it has always been the case that allies spied on each other, right? This is not unusual. This has happened. You just don't want to get caught. In the case of Pollard, I don't think we really know what he did. I don't think it's ever been really revealed, so we can have opinions, but it's not based on fact. But the Pollard situation was reviewed by 2 or 3 different presidents from different parties, and they all elected to keep him in prison.
Oh, good point.
What if in Lebanon, we would have accomplished the mission of defeating, or whatever the right word would be, the PLO? In hindsight, maybe that if that had happened, would things have been much different for the state of Israel in the ensuing subsequent years?
So I suspect on some theoretical level that makes sense, yes. On the other hand, the PLO or the uprisings are not necessarily as centralized as we'd like them to believe. So we could have wiped out a particular group and there'd be 16 more. It's like, there'd be ISIS, there'd be somebody else. And so though, yes and no.
Yeah.
It's a good Jewish answer.
Yeah. That's why there's so many Jewish lawyers, I guess.
That's right.
Yeah.
All right, I am going to go on, and at the end, I don't have a lot more, and I really will open the floor. That was my goal for today, was to try and provide people with the chance to share their views. Okay, all right. So the Palestinian Intifada, which begins in December of 1987, increases American Jewish criticism of Israel. American Jews are pulled by the images of Israeli repression of the rebellion. Obviously, the TV stations are choosing what they show us too. Convinced that the revolt demonstrated the hopelessness of the continued occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, increasing number of American Jews begin to criticize not simply specific government actions, but the entire thrust of American foreign policy. American Jews become sharply divided. The left is criticizing Israel's repression and calling for a peace conference. The right is accusing the left of political naivete and self-hatred. Reflecting, and so we remember after 67, none of these conversations were happening. We're seeing increasing divisiveness. Reflecting these divisions, an ad hoc group of American Jewish activists and academics engaged in an unprecedented initiative in December of '89. They meet unofficially with Yasser Arafat, and they announce that the members of the PLO are sincere about peace, and the United States should end its ban on talking with them. Given that a week later, the administration here decided to renew discussions with the PLO, it appears that this radical group of American Jews had acted as catalysts on American policy against Israeli desires. By 1990, 3/4 of American Jews declared themselves to be in favor of talks with the PLO. The Intifada had greatly expanded the permissiveness of open display of American Jewish descent. The increase in Israeli security resulting from the collapse of the Soviet Union, the defeat of Iraq in the 1991 Gulf War, further encourages disunity. So Israel's safe. We can say whatever we want. So therefore, disunity thrives in the American Jewish world. By raising the possibility of a peace treaty with the Palestinians, the election of Rabin in August of '92 led to new levels of public disagreement. In America, the Orthodox and politically conservative, who had long equated public Jewish criticism of Israel with treason, now excoriated the Rabin government as being too willing to trade land for peace. The now public display of intra-Jewish conflict assumes an almost soap opera-like quality. In July of '93, Tom Dine, the longtime head of AIPAC, is forced to resign for referring to the Orthodox Jews as smelly and low class, while 2 weeks later, one of his vice presidents meets a similar fate, calling the dovish Deputy Prime Minister Yossi Berlin a little slime ball. We've reached new heights. Reached new heights. Yitzhak Rabin's conclusion of the Oslo peace treaty with the Palestinians in October of '93 mobilizes the right wing in both Israel and in America. The political importance of American Jews, especially to Israel's right, become evident when opposition leader Benjamin Netanyahu chooses the op-ed page of the New York Times to condemn the proposed Israeli PLO peace treaty. In a further overturning of traditional boundaries, the opposition Likud directed its American supporters to lobby Congress to cut off aid to the PLO and to transfer the Israeli American embassy to Jerusalem by May of 1999. American Jewish politics was in such disarray that Rabin complained, and if you haven't, it's reading 4, never before have we witnessed an attempt by US Jews to lobby Congress against the policies of a legitimately democratically elected Israeli government. The assassination of Rabin and the election of Netanyahu exacerbate divisions in the United States. The extreme harsh criticism of the right wing, which had accused Rabin of selling out Israel, is replaced by the criticism of the left wing, which is accusing Netanyahu of sabotaging the peace process. However, it's Netanyahu's religious policies that led to the most bitter and protracted split between American and Israeli Jews. In April of 1997, the Orthodox parties of the Knesset, without whom Netanyahu could not reach a government, all right, proposed the passing of a law in which conversions to Judaism performed by non-Orthodox rabbis would no longer be recognized. American Jews, 85% of whom are not Orthodox, reacted with unbridled rage. Many Jews withheld their customary donations, and the UJA experienced a $20 million shortfall. The Knesset's failure to pass that conversion bill was directly the result of American Jewish pressure. American Jewish displeasure with Netanyahu over religion and his negative attitudes towards the Oslo Accords produced to that point the widest split between mainstream American Jewry and Israeli administration. But things keep going back and forth as we've seen. By the spring of 2002, the accumulation of suicide bombings and the massacre of 29 people at a public seder in Netanya led American Jews back to full support of Israeli government. The seemingly endless suicide bombings and the resulting Israeli assaults on the West Bank, as well as the execution of Jewish journalist Daniel Pearl by Muslim terrorists, convinced American Jews that Israel and perhaps all of Jewry was experiencing an existential crisis. On April 15, 2002, the largest pro-Israel rally in 3 decades took place in Washington, D.C., drawing over 100,000 people. In late June, President Bush, the first, stunned even the strongest supporters of Israel by taking the Israeli position that if any progress was to be made towards peace, Arafat would have to be removed. Over time, however, again, as suicide bombings began to abate, and Israel, now unequivocally supported by the world's only remaining superpower, Israel seems less imperiled, and the line of public communal solidarity begins to waver once again. Israel's reoccupation of much of the West Bank had greatly reduced the incidence and severity of suicide bombing. So there's a reality on the table here. However, instead, and this is Bush, instead of implementing a program to remove Arafat as he had spoken of, the Bush administration becomes more concerned with ousting Hussein, and the possibility of war with Iraq replaces the Israeli-Palestinian conflict on the front pages of our newspapers. I'm exhausted just talking about it. In recent years, American Jewish support of Israel has continued to decline in the percentage, I think this is what you were saying, Eric, of funds allotted to Israel through American Jewish fundraising. We still can continue to do major fundraising, but the percentage that goes to Israel has been reduced. These trends are particularly noticeable. They are pronounced in the younger generation. Stephen Cohen, the sociologist, has found that for every 10-year drop in age, there is a 5% decline in support for Israel. So one of the principal challenges that for fundraisers and for all of us is how do we build bridges in this younger generation? The trends that we're seeing are in part inevitable to some degree. They're the result of the passage of time. Those who experienced the Holocaust, those who experienced the birth of Israel are passing on, right? It's before many of our times. The emotions associated with those events, even the memories of the unimaginable horror and boundless ecstasy lose their power over generations. Israel's heroic age has passed. The desert's already bloomed. Millions of immigrants have been absorbed, and the country has defended itself against great enemies, and it had produced a high culture with democratic values. Israel, by all those definitions, had been a success. But with it, fractious normalcy has replaced the emotional high points of the founding of the state, the Six-Day War, and other events such as the Entebbe raid. The existing gulf in worldview, of history, and in daily life between Israeli and American Jews, who knows if that bridge is even possible? Far from being American Jews, far from being eternally transformed by Israel, the majority of American Jews remain ignorant and skeptical. Going back as far as 1989, all right, we're talking about 30 plus years ago, a poll indicated that less than 66% of American Jews knew that the year in which Israel was founded. I'm done. I now open the floor for discussion. Again, I ask that it remain civil no matter what. Sandy, yours was the first hand I saw, so go for it.
Martin, I just want to make a couple of comments about where we are today, because
Please.
I think it's really important. The first comment I would make is that the prior emphasis on fundraising as the conduit for relationship between Israel and American Jews is ridiculous, since Israel has one in the top 20 economies in the world in per capita GDP. Israel does not need money from us. They need something else, but not money. That's number one. Number two, in fact, I think the Jewish community here needs more money than they need to send money to Israel. That's number one. Number two, since the biggest denomination of affiliated Jews in the United States is clearly Reform, something like 38% in the 2020 Pew assessment,
right,
where Orthodox is less than 10%, the continuous rejection of equality for conservative Reform Jews in Israel is a major sticking point. And the Israeli governments have reneged on this commitment on the wall and so forth over the last several years. Bennett is right now wavering again on this issue. And I will make a statement that people may say Kagan's crazy. Israel is the only Western democracy in which Jews do not have freedom of religion. Because if you want to get married in Israel by your conservative rabbi, it is not valid.
Yeah, that's a strong statement.
So that's a stunning sounding statement.
It's great.
It happens to be true.
Yeah, it's great. Just
so I think that the biggest issue for the internal Jewish world is whether Israel and America as the biggest diaspora community will be unified about being a Jewish people, or whether internal Israeli politics will continue to damage the relationship between Israel and American Jews.
So just emphasizing your first point about the economy, you probably know after Hurricane Harvey, Israel sent us $1 million. That's unheard of. All right, Sandy.
Okay, several slightly disjointed comments. One, I've been told by a very reliable source within AIPAC that the policy of AIPAC is not to publicly criticize the state of Israel, which is not to say that they are not critical in private conversations. Right. Number two, the reaction in 2017 to Netanyahu reneging on a number of promises and the official rabbinate in this, I forget the exact term, it did cause a number of American Jewish leaders, prominent people, to be very critical of what the Israeli government did. Number three is over the years, and I have a lot of knowledge of this, over the years, the percentage of the annual campaign of our federation that goes to Israel has declined significantly. But part of that decline, and perhaps a major part of that decline, is for my parents' generation, Israel was a third world country that could not feed its people, and there were no Jewish day schools in Houston. And again, day schools is just one symptom, but Israel is a thriving economy with still a lot of very important social needs that we support. But we also have a lot of day schools. We also have a lot of poor Jews in Houston, et cetera. Next comment is, that's not because people don't support Israel. It's just that the actual facts on the ground are very different than they used to be. Even the percentage of foreign overseas money that goes to Israel as compared to the American Joint Distribution Committee has changed over time because there's lots of Jews who are suffering in other parts of the world. I think our children's generation only remember Israel as an occupying party, occupying nation. It's very easy to sympathize with people who you perceive as oppressed. It's harder to identify with people who you see as oppressors. And these are all black and white views, and there's mostly shades of gray. Another idea, and again, I confess I'm very strongly Zionist, but 1982 invasion of Lebanon, even the bombings in last May, I'm very anguished. My soul is anguished by what the Israelis did. But the most recent, again in May of 2021, to not respond heavily is to say that if you are willing to hide behind civilians when you lob rockets, and then therefore you are exempt from retaliation, is a very, very bad thought. So I will turn it over to my wife, who has her own views.
A couple of items. When Sandy and I had our first trip to Israel in 1971, doing Europe and Israel on $5 a day, I remember in Israel, we were on a bus and stopped someplace to eat, and we're sitting at a table. It was kind of like family style, whoever sits there. And when we're chatting with this Israeli fellow, and he finds out that we're Jewish and we come from America, so new, why didn't you emigrate here? This is Israel, the land of the Jews. You should do that. But then scroll down history, when the first Intifada took place, and you saw on the TV screens how these young Arab boys were throwing stones at the Israeli soldiers and everything, and they could get killed and whatnot. And I'm thinking, as a mother, what mother would want to have their child in that position of injury and getting killed? And I'm thinking, between the Western thought and the Middle Eastern thought, how can we come together when those values are so different? I mean, it's so basic. Who would want to put their child in danger And, oh, good, you should, get killed and go up, and the virgins and everything like that. But on the other hand, and I know, Cantor, you will know this, that over a couple of generations, we have found that keeping our children Jewish strongly depends on whether they go to a Jewish day school, whether they go to a Jewish summer camp, and if they have a trip to Israel. And you may or may not be Zionists, but if you're not ultra-Orthodox and know that your child will always stay in the Jewish community, these were the options to keep your children there.
Yeah, just to qualify that just a bit, each of those three in connection, in joint work, seem to work again, but you're playing odds.
Okay.
The reality of it is none of that there's no guarantee. You could send your kid to yeshiva, send them to Israel, send them to Jewish day camps, and you still, there's no guarantee on anything. You're playing your odds. And people succeed doing one of the three. They succeed doing two of the three. There's no guarantees. We're all, anything to do with child rearing is playing odds.
It just, you're absolutely right. It increases the odds, and you look at the statistics and it clearly increases the odds, but we know people who sent kids to day school. They actually lived in Israel. They sent their kids to Camp Young Judea, and 2 out of 3 married non-Jews who are very supportive of the Jewish spouse raising the kids as Jewish.
Right. Right. And sometimes we get new Jews out of that too. Right, Michelle? Right. Anybody else? 3 of them. Yep. This is why I appreciate that. Again, Israel is a topic. Lori Actor will remember about 7 years ago, I said to her, this is an absolute hole in my Jewish knowledge. And I spent a year with about 40 or 50 books. And I just kept reading. And then I went to Israel, and I've continued to read and journal articles, etc. There is no end to the learning, and to be able to sit here today and learn from each of you in this process, this is why it's such a joy. It's such a joy to engage like this. Martin.
Yes, and a suggestion to people, obviously a much longer topic than we can discuss now, but there have always been different philosophies of Zionism. Yeah. And the philosophy of Zionism that I believe in is the Zionism of Achad Ha'am. Now, we don't need to go into the details, but basically it says there will be Jews in the diaspora and there will be Jews in Israel. And what's important is the connection between them.
Right.
That's why I said the things that I said. It was the opinion of people like Achad Ha'am that prevailed at the 1903 Zionist Congress.
Yeah.
When Herzl and others favored the establishment of a Jewish state in Uganda. Mm-hmm. And they said, what do you mean Uganda? It can only be Eretz Israel, right? But the idea that, and so the idea of Ben Gurion and people like Ben Gurion, as great as Ben Gurion was, of Shlilat HaGolah, the destruction of the diaspora, is really ridiculous. The most important thing we can think about is the relationship between Jews in America, where there are 6 million, and Jews in Israel, where there are 6 or 7 million. That's the Jewish world, those two communities, and the relationship between them is incredibly important.
Yeah, so the very fact that if you've taken the Melton course on Jewish history, it talks about the fact that they're, even at its earliest stages, they sat down with trying to determine what Israel would be. There were minimally 4 Israels, from the Orthodox to the Achad Ha'am, to the sitting down at a table and saying, how do we possibly live together when we have no choice? There's not going to be a second state. How are we going to work and compromise? God, I wish that attitude prevailed in society today. How do we not become such ideologues that we can no longer have a conversation? And to say that's true in terms of cross-culture, cross-nation as well, as you're describing. We need to get rid of far extreme ideology and sit down at a table and treat one another with respect. I don't care which end of the spectrum you're on. All right. So much for that. So we're off for 2 weeks. We're coming back and we'll do a little bit of Texas Jewish history. So just to give you a sense of what is coming up after that. In March, we're planning to have a one session with Houston Jewish Funerals about the process of dying, et cetera. And then I'm going to do 3 weeks on the afterlife within Judaism. Okay, so that will be following that sometime in late March, early April. Next year, I'm planning to do 3 courses, but 3 courses. One is introductory Hebrew reading for those who don't read. The other 2 is once a month to do a course on Exodus. It'll take 2 years to go through the narratives of Exodus. I'm not going to deal with the laws. I'm going to deal with the stories of Exodus. 2 years of that. And I'll also do a course on the history of rabbinic times. So that's what's out there and on the horizon. So hopefully everybody will find something, and hopefully I can continue to learn from everybody here because I'm loving this process. Thank you.
Thank you.
Excellent
you so
session today.
much.
Thank you so much.
See you in 3 weeks.
Bye, everybody.
It's
Bye-bye.
sunshiny. Have a great day.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks.
Bye, everyone. See some of